extent of someone's knowledge and understanding can be gauged by the degree to which they're willing to accept that they actually know nothing. While expertise has been characterized as the art of knowing more and more about less and less, true learning, it seems to me, is all about understanding and appreciating just how much you will never know. For example, at the age of 46, I am just starting to realize how vast and unbridgeable are the gaps in my knowledge of the history of cinema, a medium which has only been around for just over a century. Even if I dedicated every waking moment of the next 20 years to studying the art of silent cinema, the growth of Indian cinema, the canon of Japanese cinema, and the bewildering marketing expanse of the Pacific Rim, I'd still only be scratching the surface. I recently read that, at a conservative estimate, something like 20% of the films ever made no longer exist, thanks to the tendency of celluloid to disintegrate over time. Yet even with 1/5 of all movies wiped out by the helpful degradations of time, there's still no hope of me ever being able to declare myself across the history of movies, which stretches like Cinerama beyond the comforting borders of the horizon. Like my mother, the older I get, the less I know I know. Yet at the age of 23, with a couple of dodgy horror movies under my belt and a copy of Dworkin's book in my coat pocket, I knew that I knew everything. And it was with this utter sense of blinkered self-certainty that I walked out of David Lynch's Blue Velvet, a film which I now recognise to be one of the greatest movies of the 80s, and straight into somebody's fist. How did this happen? Let's start at the beginning. I had seen David Lynch's debut feature Eraserhead as a teenager at the Phoenix, where it played on a regular Friday late-night double bill with George A. Romero's The Crazies. The film was described by Lynch as a dream of dark and troubling things, and became the quintessential midnight movie hit in the US before slowly spreading its diseased spell around the globe. A surreal nightmare about a terrified man who finds himself in sole charge of a monstrous child, Eraserhead boasted extraordinary monochrome visuals, a hair-raising performance from Jack Nance, Henry, as previously noted, and a disorientatingly powerful soundtrack cooked up by Lynch and his longtime oral collaborator Alan Splett. In an early review, the trade mag Variety described it as a sickening bad taste exercise, which sounded like a recommendation to me. Eraserhead took ages to make. Lynch reportedly started work on it back in May 1972 and didn't lock the final cut until early 1977. During the course of the film's protracted gestation and birth, the director wrestled with marriage, divorce and fatherhood, supported himself with a paper round, and fueled his soul with sugary caffeine drinks from the local Bob's Big Boy Diner. During one hiatus, he completed the short film The Amputee, images from which would later be echoed in his daughter Jennifer's feature Boxing Helena. Indeed, Jennifer, who was born with clubbed feet, has been quoted as saying that Eraserhead, without a doubt, was inspired by my conception and birth, because David, in no uncertain terms, did not want a family. It was not his idea to get married, nor was it his idea to have children. But it happened. Exactly what Eraserhead is about remains a mystery. Lynch himself has proven consistently unwilling to explain the film, becoming particularly evasive on the subject of the creation of the baby. Some reports suggest that it's an animated bovine fetus. The director has, on occasion, claimed that it could have been found. All we can be certain of is that the film's primary register is nightmarish and symbolic. It is not to be taken literally. Obviously. The first time I saw Eraserhead was with my friend Nick Cooper, a schoolmate and jazz pianist whom I would enlist to play drums in an earnest post-punk sixth-form school band called The Basics. When I first met Nick, he had a disastrous flyaway haircut and wore flares, an unforgivable crime. After 3 weeks in The Basics, he had a killer crew cut and was sporting skin-tight stay-pressed trousers and cool as nuts Harrington jackets of varying colours. It was an amazing transformation for which I would like to take full credit. The truth, however, is that Nick's straight-legged butterfly emerged from the chrysalis of his 18-inch flapping cocoon after he and I went to see The Wanderers at the Barnet Odeon. The film, which was set in the Bronx in 1963, had such a profound effect on both of us that after the screening we opened the palms of our hands up with a rusty penknife and became blood brothers there and then. Nick promptly went home and sorted out his fashion mojo and remains to this day one of the best-dressed men I have ever met. God bless Philip Kaufman. Dress sense aside, Nick's judgment on movies was not always on the money. Admittedly, he was so scared by The Exorcist, which we both saw for the first time together at the Phoenix, that he had to come back to my house and sleep on the floor, for which he'll always retain a special place in my affections. And he'd been pretty open to most of the early Cronenberg canon, including Shivers and Rabid, both of which were fairly freaky films full of creepy latex mutations and twisted sexuality. The latter starred porn queen Marilyn Chambers in one of her few straight dramatic roles as a woman who becomes infected by a phallic parasite which lives in her armpit and bites people during sex. Chambers had teamed up with Cronenberg at the suggestion of producer Ivan Reitman and had worked on the movie under the watchful gaze of our old friend Chuck Traynor, who was by then her manager husband and whom Cronenberg significantly described as not my favourite kind of guy. Anyway, Nick coped with the sexual monsters of Rabid okay, but when it came to Eraserhead and its journey into the dark heart of man's most deep-set Freudian nightmares, he just didn't get it at all. It was easy to tell when Nick wasn't getting a movie because his left leg would bounce up and down in a state of hyper-caffeinated agitation. The more his left knee trembled, the worse his experience of the film. It was like watching someone review a movie in real time, but from the waist down. Even if his mouth said nothing, his fidgeting calf muscles spoke volumes. The leg trembling began about 15 minutes into Eraserhead, at around the time that Henry first returns home with the mutant baby, whose existence is never explained beyond a general sense of creeping guilt about everything. As Henry laid the baby on the table, Nick muttered loudly, "Well, that would never happen." At first I thought he was making some kind of profound surrealist joke and laughed. It was like looking at a painting of melting watches by Salvador Dali and declaring that they'll never be very effective timekeepers. But Nick wasn't joking. He was seriously doubting that someone would find themselves in the position of having fathered a bizarre alien baby and then being required to tend to its needs in a small room which contained little other than a bed and a radiator in which lived a hamster-cheeked woman who sang to you at night while squishing extraterrestrial sperm beneath the heel of her tap shoes. It just wouldn't happen. My only comparable experience of this sort of overly literal film criticism came when I took my sister Annie to see Lucio Fulci's entertainingly revolting City of the Living Dead at the ABC in Edgware. She was training to be a doctor, and during one particularly gruey scene in which a demonically possessed young woman vomited up her internal organs, Annie turned to me and whispered, "Well, that's not scary. They're all in the wrong order." Apparently the offal spewing from the poor actress's mouth was not biologically accurate, and was therefore failing to send a shiver down my sister's hospital-hardened spine. As for Nick, he expressed his belief that Eraserhead just wouldn't happen in increasingly irritated tones, his pulsating left leg throbbing to the rhythm of his growing impatience, causing an entire row of chairs to quiver and quake like jelly on a plate. It was like watching the movie in Sense-Around. A year or so ago, whilst broadcasting on BBC 5 Live, I described Nick's declaration that wouldn't happen as being the stupidest thing I had ever heard anyone say in a cinema. Nick promptly texted me to take full credit for the comment and to assert that he still stood squarely behind his original assessment. This is one of the reasons that I like Nick so much. Not only was he the person with whom I had the electrifying experience of watching The Exorcist for the first time, not only was he living proof that a good haircut and a Harrington could turn you from zero to hero overnight, over and above all these things, he was as forthrightly mad and assertive in his opinions of everything as I was. This was a man who, when everyone else was sporting sunny nuclear 9 Danker stickers, had "Peace through NATO" proudly emblazoned upon his windshield. Politically, we were worlds apart, but personally, we really were blood brothers. Anyway, back to Manchester. My respect for David Lynch had grown with The Elephant Man, which I took as proof that Nick had been wrong about Eraserhead. After all, John Merrick really did happen, and I'd even had a bash at embracing the dismal Dune, which I remember largely for containing a scene in which Sting comes out of an interstellar steam shower with nothing but a pair of silver wings on his knackers. I could go back to the movie to check whether this scene really happened or whether I'm just making it up, but frankly I can't be bothered. Considering Sting's recent adventures with a lute and his outpourings about tantric sex, not to mention the rotten music he's made since Roxanne, I think he deserves to come in for a little unfact-checked stick. Oh, and for the record, I thought he was crap in Quadrophenia too. Ace-face my arse. But Blue Velvet was a problem. Firstly, I'd made the mistake of reading a load of press coverage about the movie long before I saw it, something I have since learned to avoid. According to the reports, Lynch's latest wallowed in the degradation of women and featured a central character, Dorothy, played by Isabella Rossellini, who actively colluded in her physical abuse by a psychopathic misogynist kidnapper, Frank, played by Dennis Hopper, who famously told Lynch, "I am Frank." Reports of a prone Dorothy instructing Carl MacLachlan's preppy Geoffrey to hit me after she'd been raped by a drug-crazed Frank presented a picture of an indefensible male fantasy, particularly to a know-it-all adolescent politico who couldn't see past the end of Andrea Dworkin's nose. So, there I was in the Corner House cinema, a head full of dogma, watching Blue Velvet, my overly politicised psyche growing more frazzled by the minute. We got through Dennis Hopper throwing Isabella Rossellini on the floor and screaming, "Baby, what's the fuck?" while inhaling some non-specific gaseous substance, watched through the slats of a closet door by a furtive Carl MacLachlan, who was indeed then instructed to hit me harder. It was a bizarre and shocking scene, disorientating and grotesque, yet simultaneously orchestrated and absurd. But since I'd known that it was coming, I was kind of prepared for the worst. What I wasn't ready for was the sight and sound of Dean Stockwell lip-syncing to Roy Orbison's In Dreams while cradling a cabin light in his hand like the old lozenge microphones which crooners would caress, a performance which Dennis Hopper's over-agitated Frank would memorably describe as suave. God damn, you are one suave fucker. Now, being a fan of 50s and 60s bubblegum pop, I really liked In Dreams, and my response to this unforeseen audio-visual stimulation was not unlike that scene in A Clockwork Orange, in which Alex is forced to watch horrible acts playing out on screen to the accompaniment of his beloved Ludwig van Beethoven. "It's not right," screams Alex, and at that moment I knew exactly how he felt. Without even thinking what I was doing, I sprang out of my seat and headed up the aisle, unsure as to exactly which of the movie's many offences, the violation of women or the violation of pop music, had really pushed my buttons. All I knew was that this was a bad film, and I was going to say so. Which I did, first vociferously in the bar, and then later in print, in the pages of City Life. Oh, don't get me wrong, I didn't get the prestigious first review of the film, just a tiny listings roundup during the later phase of its release. But I badmouthed it in print, rubbishing Lynch's puerile grasp of complex sexual politics and charging him with several politically incorrect offences against right-thinking, right-on sensibilities. I really couldn't imagine a situation in which it was justifiable, let alone helpful, to come up with a story in which a woman becomes sexually enslaved by a psycho only to discover that his violent madness is perversely in tune with her own latent masochism, making his madness somehow her fault. As usual, I was right, Lynch was wrong, and that was all there was to say on the matter. Like I said earlier, it's amazing just how confident you can be when you really don't know what you're talking about. On the other hand, American critic Roger Ebert did know what he was talking about, and he really took against Blue Velvet too. His one-star review, however, was erudite and well-argued, unlike mine, and beautifully expressed his negative reactions to the film. "A film this painfully wounding," wrote Ebert with his usual honesty and candour, "has to be given special consideration, and yet those very scenes of stark sexual despair are the tip-off to what's wrong with the movie. They're so strong that they deserve to be in a movie that's sincere, honest and true, but Blue Velvet surrounds them with a story that's marred by sophomoric satire and cheap shots." He proceeded to berate Lynch for flip-flopping between ice-cold sexual horror and cheesy satirical Americana, arguing that the movie is pulled so violently in opposite directions that it pulls itself apart, and demanding, what's worse, slapping somebody around or standing back and finding the whole thing funny? Ebert's insights were right on the money, and I wish I'd had the skill and self-awareness to say something half as interesting. Crucially, Ebert recognised and acknowledged that his problem with Blue Velvet lay in its power, a power which the critic felt almost angry at the director for squandering and mocking. If the film had been just rubbish, Ebert surely wouldn't have taken against it so staunchly. It would have just been another flawed 2- or 3-star movie featuring a few distracting set pieces but little to get upset about. Yet the fact that the scenes of Rossellini's assault, masochism and later public degradation hit Ebert so hard, and indeed seemed to contain some kind of awful human truth, made the fatuous context of their presentation all the more intolerable. It was precisely the things that Lynch had got right that fired Ebert to berate him for what was wrong with Blue Velvet. It was a terrific example of a critic taking responsibility for his own reactions to a film. My review had none of that, none of the critical insight, none